Welcome, everyone. My name is John Ryan, Director General of Policy at Emerging Payments Association Asia, and I'm joined on the webinar with my co-director, Camilla Bullock, who is Director General of the Community. Today marks a very significant event for Emerging Payments Association Asia, where we look at the important topic of cross-border payments, and in particular, the report that was recently by the G20 by FSB, the Financial Stability Board, where they look to the roadmap for the future, the next 4 years, and how to enhance cross-border payments. I'm joined in the studio today by Philip Finnegan, who is the Managing Director of Temenos, and also a well-known payment professional across the region. Today's event is very much about collaboration, and that's something that we do specialize in and very much to our core at Emerging Payments Association. We collaborate to create a unified voice, and we collaborate to improve the lives of everyone through payments. Our collaboration is performed through events, and the events feed into the project work we do. We run 5 projects here across Asia Pacific, and there are many other projects across the emerging payments, other chapters across the world. The projects that we run are member-driven for member outcomes, and they're always delivered to the table of the regulator. Today's event is going to focus on some of the output that we have discussed at an earlier executive workshop with global payment leaders. And one of the significant events that occurred during that workshop was the announcement of a memorandum of understanding with the Institute of International Finance and Emerging Payments Association worldwide, as we look to a future for the next 4 years, next 3 years, at how we're going to collaborate across our joint memberships to help to solve the challenges around cross-border payments. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to Philip Finnegan, who's going to lead the ceremonies from today. Philip, over to you.
Thanks, John. So great to spend this afternoon with you, and I'm joined by a couple of panelists who I will introduce in a couple of moments, who participated in the earlier workshop that John mentioned with payments leader from our region, Asia Pacific, and across the globe. We spent some time working through a number of items from the FSB Stage 3 report and roadmap for the rollout of a stronger, more transparent, lower cost, and more engaged cross-border payment solution. That roadmap, if you've not had a chance to read, looks at some of the key issues, 4 challenges, 7 friction points, and 19 building blocks that have now been developed into a plan across the remainder of 2020 into 2021 to actually look at how we could improve as an industry led by government in a public and private collaboration to improve cross-border payments. I'm going to ask each of our participants from the panel to introduce themselves. We'll chat about some of their real-time considerations that they're seeing from the report and our executive workshop, and then we'll have some dialogue. I appreciate your time is very important, and here at EPA we want to make sure that we maximise the value of this session, but we'll finish promptly at the end of the hour. With that chat, we like it to be very engaged, so I encourage you to put chat through the chat box that's there. Send us some questions and we'll ensure that we have some robust dialogue between our participants. So without further ado, I might hand over and ask Danielle, Stephen and Lawrence just to introduce themselves. And it'd be great if they could give a particular point or thought that they found once they read the FSB report on cross-border payments. And we'll start off with Danielle Cito from SCB. Over to you, Danielle.
Thank you so much, Philip and John. Real pleasure to be here. And thank you as well for my participation in that earlier workshop. And for those who are not familiar with this ongoing series of reports that have been launched by the FSB and the BIS CPMI, I don't think it can be understated just how significant this particular roadmap is that's actually been proposed. It's an extremely important development, and I think that all of you who've been in the industry now for some time will know that there's a number of different themes that are impeding the efficiency and effectiveness of cross-border payments, and especially when it comes to things like cost and financial inclusion. Well, this report basically has something for everybody. And so I think that, certainly from where I sit at Standard Chartered, where I run Greater China North Asia FinTech Advisory, serving our FinTech and new payments methods clients, and also with the other hat that I'm wearing today, which is the chair of the advisory board for the Emerging Payments Association of Asia, which of course is very, very interested in the outcomes of this particular roadmap and report. These issues could not be more fundamental. And I think that what I was certainly very, very pleased to see, and I think that there was some extremely interesting and robust dialogue in today's workshop centering around the fact that, this roadmap that has been proposed, which covers pretty much something for everything from digital identity, KYC utilities, standardization of regulatory frameworks and harmonization, ISO 20022 application, everything. It's an ambitious roadmap, and the key word that was used a number of times was ambitious. And ultimately, of course, the other word that then came out the back of that was accountability. How do we make sure that all of the things that are being proposed, because if they were going to be able to be delivered, would be quite transformative to the industry, but how do we actually make sure that they actually end up getting delivered on time and to the standards that with the outcomes that we actually expect as the industry? So certainly that was one of the most interesting observations I had from that earlier discussion. Back to you, Philip.
Absolutely. We'll come back to that topic of accountability, involvement, the public-private collaboration. That's great. Thank you. Stephen from FIS, it'd be great if you could introduce yourself and talk about one of the thoughts that you took away from either the report or our discussion earlier.
Yeah, thanks, Philip, and good afternoon, everybody. I look after payments for Asia, for FIS, and there's a huge number of different payment types, different payment methods, and different modalities across all the different regions, participants, intermediaries across the regions. A very, very dynamic and fluid space. So I wholeheartedly endorse the FSB report and all of the different outcomes and focus areas and tasks that we need to work together across to deliver that kind of vision. Danielle just used the word ambitious, which is great. I probably would put the word daunting alongside that, because I think it is a big ask to move a lot of different countries, a lot of different participants in the market forward in the same direction. It hasn't been done before, to the best of my knowledge, outside of a kind of a political union. So, but the opportunities for transformation are significant, tremendous, actually. So the onus is on all of us to work together and try and push the agenda along. It will be difficult, will be daunting, but I think the report covers all the different areas that need to be addressed. And I think even achieving half of them will make a tremendous difference in the payments industry across the region. The things that jumped out to me, I think, are the things I called out earlier today. The real need to provide a strong identity component to the solution to make sure we take out a lot of the friction that the participants have to carry out as payments are transacted across the market, by the participants having to know the sender, having to know the beneficiary, and pass all that information along with the payment. So that's going to be a key thing. But I also I'd like to look at the role of Pan-Asian bodies, whether they're regulatory, whether they're even banks operating in the space, who could also take out some of the risks. Because otherwise you'll have the global transaction banks or regional transaction banks able to operate but you'll have a mix or a hybrid approach from other participants. I'm not sure whether that will really serve the cross-border space in Asia Pacific particularly well, or whether there is a role there for a private consortium or a private settlement bank to step in and sort of offer some capabilities to smooth some of those troubled waters. I would anticipate as a scheme like this gets rolled out. So anyway, that was it from my observations. I'll pass back to Philip.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. There's a few things in both your comments and Danielle's we should unpack in the next hour. And in the spirit of three-letter acronyms with EPA, SCB, and FIS, Lawrence from IIF, if you could give us an introduction to all of our attendees, and be really good as part of yours if you could also extend about the MOU that's been signed between IIF and EPA.
Thanks very much. So the Institute of International Finance, often confused for the International Institute of Finance, is a global organisation of about 450, mainly financial institutions, also payment service providers, also asset managers, insurers, but also central banks, development banks, and others. So and they tend to be the internationally active financial institutions. So we obviously very much welcome the roadmap from the FSB. And I think the thing that jumped out at me, other than what's already been mentioned, were two things. One is it's very much a collaborative effort between the public sector and the private sector. It has G20 leaders imprimatur, so it has a higher status than this project has had in the past. And there's a real sense of accountability of G20 finance ministers and central bank governors for delivering. Having worked at the FSB for 3 years, it can't be overstated how important that imprimatur from G20 leaders is in actually getting bureaucrats and regulators to kind of move at a reasonable pace. I think this is an opportunity. It comes at a time, obviously, of accelerated digitalisation, and I guess optimism that maybe the pandemic has forced people to kind of grasp nettles that have been there for many years. So the collaborative nature of the roadmap plays into this MOU that we've just signed with the EPA, and we have great pleasure in doing so. These are memberships that overlap, but are pretty complementary on the whole. So we look forward to working in partnership with EPAA over the next 3 years, or potentially longer. So the focus of the MOU is around this roadmap and delivering, and it's a joint consultative forum. So it'll be a way for our members to discuss matters of mutual interest and potentially have joint submissions, because a big part of the roadmap is there are lots of ports for consultation out until 2024, both at global level and also nationally. So we really need to get our ducks in a row as to what we're going to tell the official sector and what are the key pain points and the low-hanging fruit. Just on digital ID, the IF was also working collaboratively with the Open ID Foundation, something called the Open Digital Trust Initiative, which envisages a vibrant marketplace for digital trust services. And I'm using some expertise I developed at the FSB around governance of unique identifiers, and also a good understanding of the legal entity identifier to try to help our members move forward along with other IF colleagues. And that's an exciting project, and it is an open project, so others are welcome to join in. So I'll hand back to John and Philip.
Thanks, Lawrence. Thank you for that explanation, and very exciting news about the MOU between EPA and IIF. At this point, we'd like to engage our audience, and we're going to raise a poll, which should appear on your screens, I'm hoping, John, with some questions around important topics and priorities to enhance the cross-border payments option. So it'd be great to get the feedback, and we can discuss that between the panelists about what do you see are some of the priorities, or your priorities, as we look to the FSB report driven by G20 initiative in coming years. So we will wait a moment. I don't think we can vote on this one, Danielle, Stephen and Lawrence, but we'll definitely hear your voices in a couple of moments.
Yeah, and it is multiple choice as well. So,
oh, great.
Yeah, you can select more than one if you believe.
So you'll see some polls coming in shortly, will we, John?
Yeah. So I just So I'll just give it 10 seconds.
And then we'll share those results. Fantastic.
Great. Okay, let's close it off then.
Brilliant, thank you. And can we share those results? So, so the highest priority is around regulation by a long way. That's very interesting. I know transaction cost is low. I do ponder about that. But clearly access is a key item. So when it came to the FSB report, and I perhaps might throw this to our panelists for a moment, they actually put down 4 areas: high cost, low speed, not high speed, limited access and insufficient transparency. Danielle, so I might throw to you first. Is interested in your view of these particular elements and where you see some opportunities for improvement in the near future.
Absolutely, and I think that what the the stage 1 and 2 reports really did a very good job of setting up the foundations of this particular roadmap in terms of being able to identify where you actually saw these frictions in the cross-border payments process. And I think many of you who are watching this today, as well as my fellow panelists, will be no stranger to all of these things. But everything ranging from when we had payment systems that actually weren't 24/7, and so, overlapping jurisdictions of time obviously creates friction. The repeated need to actually undertake KYC on different individuals and entities as the payments actually made their way across borders. Just all of this actually fundamentally comes down to lack of standardization and lack of regulatory harmony, the inability to move data across borders. So all of these things are quite relevant, and I think it's not really that much of a surprise to see that so many of you have actually selected regulation as being one of the most important facets. And certainly from my perspective, as we were sort of looking or having a good dialogue amongst this workshop members with the FSB who were there, this came up time and time again around the notion of standardization. And certainly from EPAA's perspective, we strongly believe in this. How can we ensure that we're working toward harmonized regulatory frameworks, but not just in the harmonization of regulation, looking at how the actual implementation of standards such as ISO 20022, et cetera, will actually be done so that you can actually rely or be able to trust that when you move from market to market, you'll have the exact same considerations. So those are the sorts of things that ultimately create a lot of the frictions in the cross-border payments environment, and I think is absolutely the right place for the FSB to be focusing, and not just the FSB, of course, but working alongside the FATF and various different regulators from the G20 as well.
You're on mute again. Stephen, very interested in your view and perhaps picking up on, we spoke earlier in the earlier workshop around pan-regional, and you discussed that in your preamble. How could that play against some of those topics that were raised by our audience?
Yeah, thanks, Philip. So I'm not surprised at all that regulation is the #1 concern, because it's the umbrella of which governs everything that we need to do, and everything else that called out earlier: high cost, low speed, limited access, insufficient transparency, are really second order effects based on the patchwork of regulation we have in Asia, if we just keep the context local, and the disparity from country to country for all those different elements. So if we can get a pan-regional framework together, regulatory framework for all the different areas: identity, data, cost, transparency, standards, and harmonization, we already take a big step forward towards addressing some of those second order effects at the regulatory level. But in the absence of that, what we do see is market-based solutions by banks, by processors, by global money remitter companies, PayPal and NIAM and people like this, who are out there solving the problem that they see in the marketplace, which is great, but they're doing it all in highly proprietary ways. And there's always going to be a place for highly proprietary solutions. And I think that should remain the case. But I would like to see that broad-based pan-regional agreement on the key elements of payment friction reach some level of agreement. And to me, I think that would be a key success factor in Asia Pacific cross-border payments, and getting them to the level that we start to see in Europe now, where across the Eurozone, with separate credit transfers, you can do instant payments person to person in 15 seconds, more or less, for all of those banks that are participating. And bill payments and other money flows through the payment system in the Eurozone, it's a very good outcome for all the participants, the consumers and corporates operating there. So I'd like to see something like that in Asia Pacific.
That would be brilliant. We should come back to that one as we tie the accountability discussion back to that pan-regional, given the complexities and the differences across our region. It's possibly easier said than done, but absolutely essential. I agree, Stephen. Lawrence, would love your view of those key topics and any insights from IIF on your approach or concerns.
Yeah, so I mean, just broadly, the IIF's position on regulation in this space tends to be that, same risks, same business, same regulation should be the sort of mantra. And indeed, we've seen that embedded in the FSB's own work on things like global stablecoins and other projects that they're working on. So we tend to think that regulation should be technology agnostic as well, and flexible, of course, while providing sufficient clarity. So we'll be very actively watching out for those consultation windows to make sure that our members' views and also EPAA's views are taken into account. The second point is that, it hasn't been mentioned yet, but incentives are important. There are economic incentives to slow payments, where the person in control of the funds can use those funds, then there are some distortions or at least incentives that come out of that. And I think as we're seeing fintechs come in and we're seeing those margins being arbitraged down, those incentives will change over time. So it's quite a dynamic picture. And hopefully the incentives that are there to have payments go very slowly will will quickly actually dissipate. Not sure that all my members would thank me for saying that, but I think it's a bit of an obvious point. Now, in terms of the work we're doing on open digital trust, we will have probably some recommendations for policymakers, but we also think that the industry has a big role to play in terms of getting its own house in order and self-organising. If you think of Bank ID, which is a Scandinavian system, that is a bank-led digital ID system that sits on top of sovereign digital IDs in a number of Scandinavian countries. And it's an interoperable but bank-led system. And, that is a potential model that we're looking at. We're also talking to the Global LEI Foundation about digitalisation of legal entity identifiers. We're looking at some of the blockchain initiatives that are out there in Europe in particular. So recommendations to industry about how to go about building a digital trust network. What does the liability framework look like? What do the governance arrangements look like? We don't have to rely on regulators to do everything for us. We can do quite a lot ourselves, while acknowledging that regulatory discrepancies can cause frictions. I guess it's worth considering there are cultural differences that don't depend on regulators as well. Like in the Middle East, they don't work Fridays, they work Sundays. And so if we're looking at global 24/7 payments instantaneous, we do need to solve for, at least be aware of, and perhaps work around some of these cultural differences. And lastly, I think there is a huge role for open standards, and we're working with the OpenID Foundation, as I said, on this Open Digital Trust Initiative, and that is very much, OpenID Foundation is working on a financial API standard, FAPI they call it, or FAPI, and also on an eKYC standard, and they're hoping to finalise both of those by the end of this year, and we see that as an important part of the initiative as well. And again, these are open initiatives, so we welcome participation, especially from our members, but also from non-members.
That's great. Thank you, Lawrence. A few things to unpack as we talk through the next half hour. I think we should talk about central bank digital currencies at some point. Might park that for a moment, but that was something we talked about in our workshop. Might ask the panelists if we could just talk about, as you look at Crossborder and look at this this initiative from FSB, and I think, Lawrence, you've already covered this question, so maybe more to Danielle and Stephen. What are your organisations doing in response to it? So getting a little practical for a moment. Interested, Danielle, I'm not sure which hat you want to wear in answering that question, but interested in what's happening in your part of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, just to briefly touch upon the Standard Chartered hat, actually, we had our global head of transaction banking, Lisa Robins, at the Roundtable as well. I thought that there was a comment that she made that was actually really lovely, which was both with respect to the actual roadmap itself as well as the CBD aspects, but certainly from the roadmap perspective, I mean, this has to be part of our payments roadmap. I mean, this is where the industry is going, and it has to be an integral part of our strategy. And, you know, certainly from the perspective of CBDCs as well, I mean, this is all part of that. And it's notable that of the sort of big sort of areas that they're focusing on, one of the areas, the fifth one, I believe, was actually looking at different methods of payment. So central bank digital currencies, stable coins. And I think that the fact that the FSB team were very much at pains to point out, this is not about promoting these things, but looking at angles where there are intersections with cross-border payments by definition. So what considerations for design actually need to be a part of this from day one, you know, in line with that sort of, you know, underlying principle of, you know, same behavior or same action, same risk, same outcome. And I think that certainly echoing some of Lisa's comments, I mean, it is a risk for the payments industry to take a wait and see approach on this, because if you wait and see, it's going to end up being built for you. And I think that whether I'm looking at this from the perspective of Standard Chartered or whether I'm looking at this from the perspective of the EPAA, this is very much the theme in Asia. Things go extremely fast. A lot of the developments in this space have been driven out of China, out of even places like Cambodia, you know, projects like Lion Rock Infinite. These have all been things that have been happening in the Asia region, which have been driving a lot of the global agenda around stablecoins and CBDCs. So I think that that is actually something that certainly we, both as the EPAA, obviously we will be looking extensively and have a lot of policy dialogue already starting to bubble up with our members looking at CBDCs and stablecoins. But certainly from the perspective of the bank is an area we've been quite engaged in for quite some time.
That's fantastic, and thank you for comfortably going two different hats there, Danielle. Very smoothly done. Stephen, interesting your view from an FIS perspective, and then I think Lawrence would be great after Stephen talks if you could talk your view on digital currencies. So Stephen, FIS view of this report?
Yeah, thanks, Philip. So it's interesting, FIS, and I wear a few different hats as well, so FIS has a very large merchant acquirer, has the capabilities of its own network to leverage for a lot of cross-border payments, and is looking to, I guess, expand that capability. But what I really see driving that is something nobody's touched on yet today. It's really, everyone just says payments, but actually, traditionally the worlds have been card payments and non-card payments, and those two worlds are actually starting to blur quite significantly, and that's driving a lot of new business initiatives. So the card payments and the card payment rails and the big networks are themselves looking to expand into account-based payments because the card payment revenues are starting to shrink, and that's a good thing, I think. But it means that they're also going to be looking to account-based payments to drive growth in their businesses. And you see banks themselves now starting to look at similar outcomes I mentioned earlier, the likes of Standard Chartered and Citibank and HSBC and other GTBs leveraging their internal networks to also offer dynamic, faster payments capabilities to their corporates and to their customers. So you see these private networks starting to emerge, and we are supporting many of our customers with that kind of private network, let's say. So they will rely less on SWIFT and rely more on the reach of their own operations to facilitate their payments capabilities. And that's a very interesting thing. It's obviously going to be much cheaper for banks, for the GTBs to do that. And some are already doing it and some are in the process of doing that. But it offers other advantages to their customers as well. So, we see, I guess, many different opportunities, Philip, for how the solutions will work out. And this is all, without the overall framework of a harmonized cross-border regulatory framework yet. But, in the absence of that, many banks and many participants in the payments industry are really experimenting with different payment initiatives, and it's a good thing to see. So we have a busy time trying to support all those different growth opportunities that the banks and other payment participants are putting out in the market.
You raise a really interesting topic there about cards, non-card payments. We've seen so many consolidations on the card payment side for many, many years, and just that explosion of options through commercial enterprises, the card networks moving into non-card payments. So that's fascinating. Perhaps a topic for another session, I think, for EPA to really discuss that, because we're seeing real commercial forces solve some of the problems that the FSB report is trying to address. That's great. Thank you, Stephen. Lawrence, I think you might have a unique view on central bank digital currencies. So we'd love your thoughts on that topic.
I'm not sure how unique it is, but I think just to draw attention to the IF very closely following this very rapidly evolving space. We've published quite a lot on CBDCs and also on global stablecoins. We submitted to the FSB's consult on global stablecoins in July, and we've had a number of events, webinars and podcasts about digital currency. I think it's very notable that Asia is probably the epicenter for CBDC in some ways. Certainly, if the People's Bank of China goes ahead with its plans for an e-yuan or digital yuan, possibly in the context of the Winter Olympics, this could be this would be an extremely important moment, I guess, in the evolution of money. As far as global stablecoins are concerned, I mean, the indications from the official sector are that eventually Libra, if it persists and addresses all the issues that the FSB and others have put on the table, that it would be approved, and so it would be it's certainly a rival to existing sovereign currencies, and therefore it would put quite a lot of pressure on the official sector to move forward with more accessible forms of money, not only at the highest wholesale levels, but further down the value chain, as it were. So we're keeping a very close eye. We're inserting ourselves where appropriate in the debate, and I think Asia is really at the centre. Although the ECB, I think it's very important that Christine Lagarde, who was the architect of the Bali, when she was at the IMF, the Bali announcements around fintech and financial inclusion, she's now heading up the ECB. So I think, personal view, not my view, it's probably a matter of time before the ECB moves on this. And then can the Fed really drag its heels, forever? Probably not.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Lawrence. Now, we've received a question from our attendees, which says, do you have any suggestions, ideas about how progress can be measured? And that definitely, that jumps to the question around accountability. Perhaps let's follow our flow and maybe ask each participant. Danielle, maybe you could start first. How do we measure progress? Is there really a way there? And we talked a lot earlier in the leadership forum around accountability, which heads role. Interested in your thoughts there from the session and individual thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, this is the really big part of it, right? Because I think you can lay out all the aspirations in the world, but at the end of the day, someone has to be on the hook for delivering these things. And what we're really talking about in a roadmap that is multifaceted as this is that you're going to have lots of different groups responsible for delivering many different components of the framework, but also then who is actually going to have holistic oversight. So it was certainly a fair amount of discussion, and certainly inside the actual roadmap proposal itself, one of the very first, or one of the really big things they need to look at over the next couple of quarters is actually the creation of metrics. And we've seen that already used to very good effect. So in particular, a lot of the work that had already been done by groups like the World Bank in looking at, the cost of remittances. But those are the kinds of things that when you put some solid metrics and KPIs around, really give visibility to a problem. And I think that the point that you raised before about the fact that there is very, very strong sponsorship of this particular piece of work by the G20 means that we do have that very, very clear visibility. And I think that these metrics that they come up with over the next few quarters are going to be absolutely key to ensuring that there is very strong focus on the right things. So the design of the metrics is going to be important. The ongoing reporting of the metrics is going to be important. But ultimately, I believe that's how they're going to try and create, very, very clear accountability to ensure that where necessary, the different regulators and country bodies are actually doing or delivering what it is they say they will deliver.
No, interesting. Is how do we track that? Again, back to Stephen's point about getting those regulators together, pan-regionally, globally. It's going to be an enormous challenge. Stephen, your thoughts on this one around accountability?
I hate this question. I really have no clue about this one, honestly. It's a regulatory policy question, I think. I just make the point that I think in the absence of any kind of shared or regulatory or pan-regional regulatory framework, you're going to see a lot of proprietary solutions, bank-to-bank bilateral solutions, processor bilateral solutions, and you'll see this patchwork. And that's probably going to make the problem worse in the short term, because you will have at a certain point back out costs to change those solutions and make them more harmonized with a regional solution should they come along. It also creates confusion in the minds of consumers and participants. Whilst it does create some competition, maybe you get some cost pressures, but look, accountability. That's a political question, and I don't think political accountability is really shown itself to be in the best light this year. So in the absence of that, I just couldn't comment anymore, I think.
Yeah. No, that's thank you, Stephen. So perhaps Lawrence, maybe you could think about measurement, less about the accountability, but the person asked about, do you have ideas, suggestions about how progress can be measured? Do we have the right reviews?
Yeah, well, uniquely, I was at the FSB for 3 years, and I worked mainly on G20 reforms that have been agreed in the wake of the GFC. And what they tended to agree on was a set of regulatory measures, and then we would measure the outcomes sort of ex post. But here they're very interestingly, I think, trying to develop some KPIs ex ante, so that there will be, so they're going to actually consult on what the measures should be, consult the industry, and then going to, and also presumably end users. And then they'll try to measure those. So in some ways, it's quite a different approach, and I think it's a helpful one. Having said that, of course, time will tell what those KPIs are. I mean, the obvious ones are around cost. I mean, the fact that remittances have tended to cost up to 7% of actual flow, but in some corridors, I think is a statistic that is continually quoted. And I think we all have probably notions as to how much regulation might, and especially money laundering, might contribute to that. So it'll be very interesting to see whether there's some sort of layering or multitude of targets in that space, or if they just go for a kind of broad brush approach. Obviously, speed, latency is an easy enough one to measure in some senses. And we have seen regional real-time payments networks. But let's not forget, even in Australia, which has the MPP, the New Payments Platform, it's still actually a bit flaky as to whether you catch a real-time payment train or you're stuck on a slow train. From a consumer perspective, there isn't a lot of transparency. And that's another area where we can expect the FSB to set out some clear goals in terms of users being able to understand where their money is and when it's going to arrive. And this is also an area where the fintechs are starting to arbitrage away the practices of the traditional bank channels, interbank channels, because the fintechs are allowing their users to know exactly how long the money will take to arrive. And I think, we can all agree that's a good thing. So I think it's a new approach to develop some KPIs up front, not just everyone agree to do certain rules or make certain changes, but what are we actually what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve? And I think those four key core problems is where they're going to be looking for improvements.
I think I might stick with you for a moment, Lawrence, because we received another question from the audience. Do you expect more regulation to be passed as a result of this report and effort? It's not just a report, it is a G20 initiative. And is there a risk that innovation in this space will slow down? So as you said, we're seeing innovation increased transparency, some novel solutions. Do you think there is a risk that we'll squash that with this effort?
Yeah, it is a risk, and therefore we need to encourage the official sector to swap out legacy regulation for better, smarter regulation, not just add kind of new regs to old regs. We also need to discourage countries from gold plating. If there's a set of global standards, we don't really want every country to have its individual add-ons, which then are quite incompatible, or at least hard for globally active players to kind of comply. Certainly if they're inconsistent, that's really hard or impossible to obey both. But even if they're not inconsistent, if they're just adding separate add-ons for no good reason. Stephen's usefully mentioned the fact that Asia doesn't really have an equivalent to the EU. And having worked also for the European Commission back in the day on MiFID I, having that architecture does actually make a big difference in terms of the whole intellectual framework of passporting and home host regulators is very useful. And so, we can build on that in Asia. We have a unique opportunity in Asia to build on that and not just copy out slavishly, but sort of intelligently adapt what's been done in Europe, which at the end of the day, in regulatory terms is pretty successful, and it covers a very culturally disparate space and knits it together into a big economic zone. Asia has 2 billion or more individuals, and it's going to be the economic powerhouse this century, and I guess it deserves to have a sort of institutional framework that's going to help.
Fantastic. No, that's great. I might switch gears for a moment, and one of the topics was digital identity that we haven't really talked through too much here. Interested, Danielle, perhaps if you could kick off the conversation there. Do you see that as a key topic? Anything you're seeing particularly in Asia that we should share with our audience today that can be of benefit to cross-border payments?
Look, I actually think that Lawrence would probably cover this a lot better than me, given particularly all the work that the fantastic work they're doing on the Trust Foundation. But just to offer a light perspective, I think on what was discussed, and I think where some of the interesting points were in the actual discussion with the FSB on the roadmap, I think that there is sort of still a lot to be looked at in terms of how they will try to actually execute on creating more harmonization of digital identity frameworks, because I think there's certainly recognition that there are a lot of country level or regional level digital identity projects that are starting to originate. And I think that certainly the FSB was trying to say, look, it's not in our interest to get in the way of these. And, potentially is it a question of us connecting them or them connecting to us? But, the idea would be to create some form of level of harmonization where it was possible. And there's a lot to be said in that statement, right? Like, how do you actually do that? Because, if you think about it, when you allow effectively a decentralized model of evolution of digital identity frameworks, you're naturally going to end up with fragmentation. So I think that it is going to be interesting to get into the detail of exactly how or what engagement mechanisms you can use to be able to bring these different initiatives together, to be able to say, we know that you're working on all of these different standards and frameworks, but where can you provide that commonality? And is it in some of the work that's also starting to happen already with the GLEID or other sorts of governance and oversight frameworks? Of course, there's a lot to be discussed in there about incentives models and whether those actually are appropriately designed in the systems right now. But these I think at the core of it, everybody agreed this was quite fundamental, but the devil is going to be in the detail.
Yeah. And somebody's raised on the chat with digital identity being such an important part of the discussion, with wide breaching effect. Is it an important topic that should be covered? Well, is it covered in the report, which it is, but does the industry need an initiative by itself? Stephen, maybe perhaps you could grab that, and then Lawrence.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. So I think it's if there are a lot of different digital identity initiatives, and I think the right approach here would be interoperability. I think trying to bring digital identity under the scope of the FSB report is just adding much more complexity and much more of a challenge to what is already an enormous challenge and enormous scope. So I'm happy with the approach of interoperability. And I think digital identity requires its own kind of global framework and people in that space to make sure that all the different initiatives are harmonized as much as possible to support payments, but also lots of other initiatives that might rely on digital identity, so voting rights and all kinds of immigration activity. So I think that belongs in its own space. And interoperability is the path.
Yeah, great. And Lawrence, I don't know if you grabbed that question just about should it be its own separate initiative or is it covered well to date? Love your insight.
Well, I mean, as I've already said, the IF does have an initiative in this space, the Open Digital Trust Initiative with the Open ID Foundation. So that's an important initiative involving our 450 odd members and an open standards foundation. Does it need a separate G20 or FSB initiative? Well, time will tell. There is, or I don't know is the honest answer. I think it may end up having to be wrapped up in a broader digital Bretton Woods type, mega deal, which, Ravi Menon of the MAS has been advocating for. And I think we see that as quite an interesting kind of intervention on his part. So what would go into such a deal? It would be around trust, but probably more around data flows, privacy. So I think this initiative by the FSB does name check digital ID, but it's not the central focus is not, and it's pretty ambitious actually. It talks about digital ID for individuals, which is a pretty hot button topic for the FSB to kind of go after, because as Australians will, with long memories or of a certain age, will remember that the Australia card was thrown out in the 80s or 90s because it was seen as a big brother. And I think we're we're probably all a lot more comfortable now with the idea of digital ID, given that we all have Google, Facebook, or other profiles. But whether we're comfortable with a sovereign digital ID in some countries, like Anglo-Saxon countries like the UK, Australia, and US, I'm not sure. And so that'll be an interesting one to watch. But on our side, we're trying to build the idea of a digital trust network, which is probably multi-layer and has many different actors and is a federated model, a network of networks, but also which takes digital ID from sovereigns at the base, as it were, but also from commercial third parties or universities or healthcare providers or whoever else who want to offer digital credentials. And there may be a space for tokenized paper ID or tokenized sovereign ID in that ecosystem. So it's very exciting times in this to try and conceptualize what exactly we're talking about. A lot of the work is around defining what we mean by a reliant party, or what do we mean by an authenticating service verification service provider or whatever. But we don't want to get bogged down just in definitions. It's around architecting something that's flexible, that's open, and that's can move things forward.
Much more very big thinking as we look at some of the global problems we face. We're coming up towards the end of our webinar today. I might just ask each of the speakers, and we'll start with Danielle and work through Stephen and Lawrence, just some parting thoughts as we look at FSB's Enhanced Cross-Border program, our workshop earlier. Any words of wisdom as we look to an ambitious program? Danielle, would you like to go first?
I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure on the wisdom part. But look, I think just certainly from the EPA Asia's perspective, and I guess probably on behalf of the whole Emerging Payments Association network, because this is very much a global initiative in the partnership that we built with the IIF. I mean, even just listening to what we're hearing today, the amount of activity that's happening in the digital identity space, and certainly that's something that's important to all of us who work in this space. But there is just so much for us to be involved in and to basically be contributing to. And I think that this really is a very unique time and a very unique opportunity to be contributing so deeply into something which is so fundamental to the absolute sort of core and foundational aspects of the industry. I do think that, particularly given the points that we raised before about the speed within areas of moving around this, and very much to those points raised earlier, I think that if we're taking that kind of wait and see approach, then somebody else is going to build that for us. So I do very much encourage people to read the reports, to get familiar with the roadmap, to contribute when those consultation papers come through with respect to the metrics, the accountability, how these things will be implemented, doing so through IIF, through EPA Asia, because as John says, we're going to be gearing up to really deliver quite a fair amount of contribution in consultation to this. But the next 12 months is going to be key.
Fantastic. Thanks, Daniel. A very exciting period, without a doubt. Stephen, your thoughts, your wisdom?
I don't know about wisdom, but the curmudgeonly commentary is probably better at my speed. Yeah, look, I think it's an exciting agenda, and I'm very much a believer in this kind of globalization and standardization initiatives. But if you look at what's happening on the geopolitical aspect, there's a lot of headwinds there. Now, maybe the US will again join the community of nations and start to support some global initiatives. But I do think you're going to have to address the inclusion aspect of all these different initiatives at some time, right? It's important that everything we do here today is not going to sort of leave some countries or some peoples or some community sectors behind. So I think that's kind of one of the things that jumped out to me is is it going to be broad-based enough to address the concerns of all the different stakeholders who need to support this. You've got a lot of tension even now within Asia Pacific over, let's say, China's position, at the political sphere, at the trade level, China's backing of the yuan. Is that how is that going to be taken into account? So it's a troubled sort of context, but again, exciting times, and I definitely believe it's the right approach, and I just hope that everybody can support it.
That's great. Thanks, Stephen. And Lawrence, your parting thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think it's not every day that your sector or industry suddenly becomes the focus of G20 leaders' attention. So this is a big opportunity for people who've been working on payments issues for decades or years. This is their time to step up with the good ideas and the smart ideas. The focus won't last forever. Like, the plan is 3 or 4 years, and the timings are flexible, but inevitably attention will move on to other topics. And so we should make hay while the sun shines and move forward rapidly while we all can, and while we still have everyone's attention. The OTC derivatives reforms, or G20 generally, the first 2 or 3 years saw about 80 to 90% of the reforms that are being put in place, really, by value at least. So I think we need to move forward quickly while we have the momentum behind us.
I totally agree, Lawrence. What an exciting time for payments nerds and geeks to be involved in something that's effectively, what did we hear earlier from the FSB? It's the number 2 priority of the G20. Somebody cheekily said, how do we make it number 1? But there's probably some other more global pressing issues they need to be concerned about. But it's somebody in our previous session actually said, this is a good thing to be thinking about. How do we make money move through our economies on a global scale? How do we help out those that are less fortunate? And some of these initiatives definitely give us that opportunity. And as Danielle, Stephen, and Lawrence have said, we can make a difference with some strong leadership. So a great session. I wanted to thank our panelists. It's been an entertaining debate. Gosh, we've covered a lot of ground. And thank you, John, for the opportunity to moderate on a very important topic. So I'll hand over to you now.
Yeah, no, thanks, Philip. And again, an excellent job. A great follow-on session to have. I think everything is aligned. We started the magnitude. I think that's very clear. We got down into real detail in this session, which is great. And, to deal with inclusion, of course, really important. And thanks for bringing that to the table, Stephen. Look, just to mention that for everyone, the copy of this session will be available. We are letting that out there. We're also to let people from this session, I guess, walk away considering how do they want to get involved in this project, because we saw in the survey earlier or the poll that it was regulation. We have a regulation project if that's where people want to be, but equally it may be on this cross-border initiative. So, let's stay in touch. Let's keep collaborating around this, because there's a lot of work to be done. Just to mention, in terms of events, on the 24th of November, we have a cybersecurity roundtable coming up. So again, that's available on our LinkedIn feed. And finally, to mention, good comes out of these events. And we reflect the work that we've done here and the contribution of everyone for our education, and we replicate that for the underprivileged through our charity B1G1. So great session, everyone. Thank you for your involvement, and again, lovely to have such a great kickoff to this initiative.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Good afternoon.